This text opens up early on the Sabbath, and immediately becomes a story filled with fear and with grief. The narrator doesn't simply tell a story that he's watching. It's almost as if you become Mary Magdalene as you're coming to the tomb. So you're not seeing Mary Magdalene come to the tomb as the narrator, as the storyteller, but you're showing what it looked like as through Mary's eyes as she saw it. And so you come to the tomb, it's still dark, right? It's this fear-induced scene. Mary Magdalene is coming to the tomb of a political person, or a person who had been executed by the political authorities, and she is a follower of hers. She could be in danger, and then she meets the worst of her expectations. Not only has he been executed, but they have taken his body to desecrate it somewhere. And she's in a panic, trying to figure out what could have happened. So you want to communicate that fear. I try to do that with my body and the weight that's down there, with the eyes, as though you're Mary seeing the stone rolled away and you're realizing what this means. So that's the first scene. She runs and in a panic tells the disciples. This almost seems like a second story inserted in the first one. You could tell just the Mary Magdalene stuff and go straight through without this diversion, but the story includes this diversion. You can again communicate the panic of Mary. Every time we hear Mary, the first 3 times we hear Mary, she's expressing this grief that the body has been removed. First to the disciples, then to the angels, though she doesn't seem to know that they're angels, and then to Jesus, though she doesn't know that it's Jesus. So I want the weight of Mary and the gravity of the situation to be communicated in your body so that people can connect their own grief to the grief that Mary is carrying. She communicates it to the disciples. You can find a commentary that'll tell you what's going on between these two guys. It's some kind of match to say which disciple really deserves authority, or they both deserve authority because one got there first but one saw things first. So it's kind of a little match between the two about who's important. But to me, what's interesting as a storyteller is they set up an empty space, right? Which is a hard thing to show as a storyteller, but they create a space between things that we can see, and the absence becomes the first sign of hope. So Peter goes into the tomb and he sees the grave clothes lying there, but the headscarf, right? So the gesture creates this space that's empty where the body of Jesus should have been. Later when the disciples then point to the evidence that Jesus is risen, they indicate that same space that's between the two of them, right? So you create a space of absence that's a place of hidden hope. The disciples go home. They're in despair. It's a little bit of an odd text because usually seeing and believing is a really important thing. In John's Gospel, it connotes faith in Jesus as the Messiah. But in this case, the words don't seem to make sense. They see and they believe, but they don't understand the resurrection. What they see and believe is Mary's testimony that Jesus' body has been stolen. So they leave in despair. Then we meet Mary. We're told twice in the same sentence that she's weeping. She's bent over. That gravity is still pulling her down. She looks into the tomb and she sees the angels. And again, that space is indicated. They're sitting there, and in the Greek it's interrupted. They're sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet where the body of Jesus had been. Again, highlighting that empty space. The angels point to this, calling Mary woman, and say, look, the space is empty, right? He was dead, he's risen, he's not here. But Mary only sees the absence, the body that's not there. She doesn't see that it's they're angels, I don't think. She's looking into a dark tomb, right? She's in a panic, we can understand. It's like if you went to visit someone you loved and the place where you had seen them buried, the dirt is thrown about and the lids of the coffin are thrown to two sides and there's space in between, right? That's the kind of panic you need to create when you're telling the story. She turns around and for the third time expresses her despair at the loss of Jesus' body and the probable desecration of it, thinking that maybe it's the one she's speaking to who has done this. She calls him Lord. She clearly doesn't understand the weight of this word, that she's speaking to Jesus, but we understand that she already is glimpsing what is true, even though she doesn't know it. She expresses that grief, and then Jesus, in a kind of a humorous interchange, I think, in the midst of the grief, he says, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Right? Because the reason she's weeping is because he's gone and he's standing there before him. Whom do you seek? Right? So it's this nice thing where Mary doesn't get at all what's going on, but Jesus does, of course, and we do as those observing it. I think this is kind of drawing upon an earlier text in the Bible, the encounter between Adam and Eve. It's a man and a woman. They're in the garden. Jesus refers to her as woman, as Adam referred to Eve before he gives her a name, right? And there, if you think about the Genesis story, they're until they're cast out into the place where death enters in. Now it's the reverse of that. She's left the place where death is, and she's going to the place where new life, new creation begins. And the turning point for Mary is when Jesus calls her name. Mary. You can play that lots of ways. It could be tender, Mary. It could be a little more direct, Mary. But I like exasperated, right? Like, we know each other so well, how could you miss me? Mary! Usually gets a laugh. People see the humor of that. And she immediately is caught up in this word of Jesus. She's turned around and she confesses him as her teacher in this tender moment. Jesus says, depending upon the translation you're using, don't touch me. But that doesn't make sense because Thomas will touch her later. I translate it as don't cleave to me because of a man will leave his, right? So the Genesis text. So it's again invoking that. But Jesus says, sorry, Dan Brown, but Jesus says, sorry, you can't cleave to me. I have to yet go to the Father, right? So in the Genesis text, you leave your father in order to cleave to another. Jesus says he can't cleave to her because he's going to the Father, but also we know that he's already left the Father in order to express love not just for one person, but to express the love at the heart of the Father to the world, right? God so loved the world that he came to do this. And so in that speaking of Mary's name, she's transformed. Suddenly the hidden hope in that absence becomes a presence, and she knows that everything has changed. By the calling of her name, she is transformed. She is sent, and up till now we've only heard these heavy, heavy words from her about the loss of Jesus, and suddenly your body will communicate the absolute joy that lifts her up. I have seen the Lord. And then there's that lovely gesture I think you can use that when he's talking to her, he says, I'm going to go to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. And so when she says, I have seen the Lord, and she told them the things that he had said to her, you can do a gesture that reminds the audience of what he had said to her. So in the telling of this story and in preaching on it, what you want to do is carry the weight and gravity of this story literally in your body so that people can connect their very different griefs to it, so that the terrain between their grief and Mary's grief gets blurred. You want to call their attention to the absence which might become the place of hope. You don't want to pretend that everything is fine. You want to know and acknowledge the absence. But you want to tell a story in such a way that they're turned around, they hear their own name called, and are resurrected with Jesus, lifted up and put down in a place of new creation and new life. God be with you as you do that.